recording it, is, I mean, I think that since we started very slowly kind of picking up pace of meeting with certain frequency and talking through some stuff and seeing that there are interesting uh, challenges that apparently interest actually quite a lot of people with diverse kind of backgrounds to work on. It seemed like it was a good idea to try to systematize this a bit and kind of spread out a sort of uh, even a research project, you know, that was, let's say, consistent enough or transmissible enough that it could be kind of seen as a sort of thing with many branches, and we can, let's say, invite other people, find out people who are interested in developing a part of it, but also have a sort of forum where results in these fronts can be brought back together, you know? So kind of something that wouldn't like increase anyone's amount of work. Is not like, let's embark in a crazy adventure and do something right now, but at the same time, sometimes if format things a bit better, it makes it so that whatever people actually do on these fronts can accumulate, you know, and you can build up on stuff. You don't need to do everything from the ground up again. So it seemed like a good idea to do this, and that's why I wrote this sort of outline that I wrote after one of our Badiou meetings.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that.
Which is, I mean, I know I wrote it very quickly, and it has this sort of, at some point, it's a bit too kind of unnecessarily ambitious, like in the way that some things are described. But at the same time, I think it does a good job in at least sketching, you know, something you can show somebody, or kind of formulate questions in a slightly better way. And I think also did something for me and Dennis, at least for me, it was really good of kind of reinforcing the fact that even though we've been working on this very sporadically, and our discussions on this have been going on for many, many years, but sometimes from very different angles, that we could actually reconstruct a bit of a structure behind it, you know, a kind of thing that is accumulating as we go along. Which is why I kind of try to summarize some points of these 4 texts that I think are heavily connected, and in ways that we haven't really explored, neither him nor me, but which definitely opened up more problems than actually solved things. And that's why I added afterwards the sort of kind of open stuff here that actually goes through to many directions, right? So regarding the stuff we're doing with Badiou, regarding more mathematical formalizations and some investigations on these on several fields, and regarding Marx, but not only Marx, and politics in a slightly more general sense, right? And after I did this, I tried to actually rewrite it in this format, just because I think this is actually perhaps might actually in the end be more useful than the text when planning where to go, or kind of getting people's input and seeing where other people's interests might actually fit with all of this, right? So that little outline, which I edited here as a sort of condensation point of all of this, it does provide a sort of background on this stuff, right? That outline talks about a bit about a particular organizational project that did have a very strong influence on how we're approaching these things. Though even before the circle itself, there are previous works that Dennis and I did together that in fact led to the very formulation of the circle. But I think it is itself a good kind of stopping point in the backtracking. But then I added like these 4 basic texts that we discussed. There's this other one here, which I also linked because there are presentations and discussions on it that are really well developed, and a couple of reading groups that are studies or classes, seminars that have been also developing this throughout the years. Like these 2 classes here, if I'm not mistaken, in fact, this one was when I first spoke with Raquel was when I was teaching this class on Frederick Jameson and economy and how do you visualize economic dynamics and complexity. And this was the continuation of that. It was like two seminars on the same topic. And at this point, this was also the moment where Caron, who is also in the Badiou group, started to work together on some of these questions, which led us to create this reading group with Badiou, which are now actually redoing in Portuguese starting next week. We also have like we're redoubling the Badiou group to a class in Portuguese, and now the one on Karatani, which also feeds into it in a certain sense. So I try to kind of in a very compressed way bring all of this together in that outline, and to sketch some questions that I think either are directly relevant or indirectly, and that kind of already appeared in discussions that either we have had all together or separately at some point. But I think that perhaps a good thing to do would be to make sure that this is, let's say, representative of something that we find that is okay as a sort of very vague background, or perhaps, you know, like it would be interesting to have a slightly more specific or expressive outline to begin from. So if we should perhaps something else would be produced as this sort of initial stepping stone. And also my idea was to talk about some of this stuff that is open and some of the material that already kind of appeared at some point as interesting kind of text to be read or to be discussed or studied that could help to develop these ideas, you know? So I thought that this is a nice way of formulating it, because you can imagine, let's say, turning this text or these themes again into either groups, right, or texts themselves. So somebody might be interested in writing something at some point or presenting something that we can record and store, and therefore other people can kind of take advantage of that previous work rather than we kind of everyone who's interested in this having to restart everything on their own. Because there does seem to be a sort of consensus might be a bit too much, but at least an interest in seeing what can come out of something like this perspective, right? Yeah, so I added some stuff here. I'm not sure if everything makes sense or if it's too personally, like it's too much kind of defined from a personal standpoint. If it's a good, if it makes sense to talk about these as central problems, or if there aren't other problems we should perhaps add here, you know, just so.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to see how they all hang together. They seem kind of like separate problems. But I mean, that's also a good thing, because it means we don't need to make everything like coherent, like a one coherent project. It can just be a collection of projects. And then when we see like a useful connection, we can explore that, but we don't need to presuppose like everything's going to be, you know, some variation of like this Bogdanov typology thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's not clear that things.
We know it's a central text, but
yeah, what I thought of doing, perhaps just to clarify why I wrote this, and perhaps we could, on top of this discussion, redefine things that seem more. I mean, of course, I think they always will seem separate, and we can always kind of further disjoint them by creating, you know, like two things coming out of one, since they might mean more than one thing, right? But I also think that, yeah, for example, this might not be so. Even this is not necessarily very important, or essential to this. But the way that I kind of think about it, that at least justifies for me the reason why these things kind of hang together in any sense from what we already discussed and the things we already did is that if you look at this previous trajectory here, we get a certain kind of, it's funny because we get a certain split coming out of a similar place, and the split has a certain kind of duality that is, I think, the thing perhaps to be bridged in a certain sense, right? Because, for example, if you look at these two texts from 2016, one is very much concerned with, let's say, using Badiou to discuss possible alternative formalizations of Marx. So I mean, stealing from Dennis or trying to condense it very, very deeply, there is a certain idea of, well, there are certain categories of, you know, the beginning of capital that become more clear how they're connected if we adopt a different meaning of phenomenology, which comes from Badiou, and this also allows us to treat them formally. And then there's a discussion on you know, the what it is to appear, the identity of appearance, relationality, and actually goes much further than that. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? Just man, Dennis, did I tell you that I found a guy who with the same name as you that talks about apparently there are many texts with this.
Oh wow, yeah.
Here.
Who would have thought? Who would have thought those two words would be so popular together?
Yeah, Dennis, you gotta choose better titles.
Yeah, more
it's not gonna come up in the Google search.
Yeah, more esoteric.
Yeah.
How do I turn this into a link?
Yeah, I was just going to say for this text, I think it still works fine. I think my understanding of Badiou at the time is, you know, very partial here. I think I would, if I could rewrite it again, I would, you know, change the Badiou parts a lot. But I mean, the basic idea still holds.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, even if we could discuss perhaps, you know, how to fine grain it, some stuff might be, you know, would change perspective if you included more stuff from Marx and things like this. In any case, I think that it's very kind of, for example, the Karatani things we've been discussing, you know, what would allow you to talk about capitalist world, right? It seems to be like there are more conditions and things like this. But I mean, still there is this sort of focus on Marx's approach to political economy and how to further, like to better frame it or to recast it with a different machinery that should make some things explicit or should also clarify certain things or allow for further developments in that approach, right? And at the same time, the reason why I mentioned the duality is that I also use the same author to talk about politics, but not from the political economy perspective, but from political organization. So there is a big discussion on this second text on, you know, how we can kind of derive a theory, and I actually also start from the beginning of Capital to talk about, let's say, social ways that social mediations are necessary for us to access rational parts of the social reality, right? So the value form helps to make something rational about capitalist society. You only see certain things if you adopt certain mediations, right? And then I try to say, well, but there might be others, and there might be a general theory of this. So for accessing certain things in reality, you might need other mediations. And the idea is that political organization is pretty much about that as well, right? So that's why it's freeing thought from thinkers, because there is something that organizations can think that thinkers cannot, right? But you see, it's kind of complementary, and it's weird because there is a common philosophical background that is opening up to these two perspectives, right? You can rethink something about political economy, or you can rethink something about political organization, but organization and economy remain separate. And I think that both texts that we wrote afterwards, this one I'll just comment afterwards, but both texts that we wrote afterwards, they seem to recognize this and to try to take a slight leap in the direction of bringing these two things together, right? Because this one is not going to have many similar texts. So your text already tried to address, for example, Jameson's idea of cognitive mapping and the problem of visualizing capitalism, and let's say, you know, tools that help us do this and things like this. So it's already kind of concerned with, you know, not simply reformulating the value form, like finding a better formulation for it, but also formulating something that is slightly more general than it, right? So it already falls, in my opinion, in the field of, okay, what else can you do? And not simply, how can I restate, like, how can I restate what exists, but also, okay, but what else could be done, right? And this text also does the same thing, because it also tries to kind of bring that debate that existed before with political organization, again with a similar background, Frederick Jameson's theory of cognitive mapping, but comparing Hayek, like thinking Hayek and Marx as their theories of price and value as specific forms of social mediation amongst other possible forms of social mediation, right? So it's kind of a very rough attempt at, if will this ever open, it's a very rough attempt at saying, okay, but like there is some dimension in which price is modeling social reality, value is a model of capitalist dynamics, and you could think about what other models could there be, right? And this could fall under a problem for political organization. So again, we have a similar situation where a similar problem is seen from two perspectives, one focusing more on political economy, another in political organization, using a similar background. But the fact that you use the similar kind of philosophical perspective doesn't necessarily allow you to bridge between the two, right? And my impression is that
I was just going to say, yes, I think maybe we characterize it as, in all four of these texts, we accept the basic principle that it is possible to have these synthetic perspectives that are not individual. And I think your half of the split is investigating how these synthetic perspectives are tied to organization, right? Mm-hmm. And then my side of the split is about when you adopt a certain synthetic perspective, you can look at a political economy in a certain way and see that certain things are now visible that weren't before. Yeah. And then this implies that, oh, well, if you strengthen that perspective somehow, or you augmented it or changed it, you would see something else.
Yeah. So I mean, that, and it's not for nothing that like this is like Badiou's theory of the subject, and this is his theory of worlds, right? Mm. But Badiou is here, and Badiou did provide, let's say, a theory that has both. And then this is like Jameson with a focus on, let's say, strengthening a formal apparatus, right? And I was trying to criticize Jameson here by saying that Jameson thought art should be the means to visualize reality, social reality, because art is somehow tied together with the aesthetic problem, with the visualizing problem, or the tools to think visualization. And I was saying that he's wrong, because for political thinking, you need political modeling.
Mhm.
So you need something more intrinsic to politics. So it wasn't so much the formal argument, let's say, it's not so much moving from organization, like, or mapping in Jameson's sense, which was artistic, to a more mathematical side, but was moving from the artistic side of the mapping to the political one. So there is a continuity, because here was about political subjectivity and here is about political organization, right? And here there's also a similarity because there was a formal theory of worlds here. And it's also here, right? But there's still this kind of split, like this sort of duality. And I think that, I mean, Zizek was very kind of sensible to this when he said that there is a weird kind of parallax inside Marxism, where it seems like in order to see political economy, you need to make politics disappear. Like when you start thinking about the value form, capital, and so on and so forth, it seems like all the categories for thinking political action disappear, because the categories for political economy, they are kind of, they happen almost like at a different scale. You're not talking about human action, strategy, and things like this. They kind of disappear in the background of very large, kind of almost incommensurate processes that are not really at the measure of people, right? So when you think, let's say, his idea is that Marxists that privilege the value form usually emphasize class struggle and political organization, and those who overemphasize or prefer to talk about class struggle, strategy, class consciousness, and things like this, they usually miss the point, miss the mark with regards to political economy. Like, you rarely get both at the same time. And he thinks that this is not like accidental, because there is something that is hard to put together. Like, it's hard to bridge the two, not in a kind of Ptolemaic way, because of course there is, let's say, Marxist theory of action and Marxist theory of political economy, but they're like of different qualities, right? And my impression is that what Badiou does here in the background is that he does provide a theory that has the whole arsenal to think subjectivity, action, organization, and so on and so forth, and a whole theory to think, to formalize the critique of political economy, you know, and so on and so forth. And we kind of respected this duality. And I think it's philosophically unified, because this is the perspective that is doing this. But it's not politically, like, it's not enough to kind of find the unity at a philosophical abstract point, because it still preserves the heterogeneity of the tools, right? Like the theory you have for the theory of knowledge you have of reality and the theory of intervention that you have, they remain incommensurate. And this is kind of recognizable in the history of Marxism, because when we fail at an intervention, at a project, at an attempt at something, it's never reintegratable back. Like, it's not we cannot interpret it in the same terms as we interpret capitalist reality, as if there is like a qualitative split, right? So like when capitalist reality contradicts itself, we have all sorts of theoretical tools to think about this, crises, contradictions, and so on and so forth. When a Marxist organization negates itself or turns around and does something it wasn't supposed to do, we call it deviation, opportunism, revisionism. It's like a moral thing. So like you have resources at this level that you don't have at this level. And at the same time, the indetermination that is open at this level is not open at this level, right? So you see like this duality at the end. I mean, I do think that the fact that these texts talk to each other very much is already a very nice sign that this is useful, this approach. But this background where you have like political organization here and political economy here, it's very hard to bridge. And it's not a problem of these texts, it's a problem of the very, let's say, tradition that we inherit, where the terms to think about this are very different from the terms to think about. So,
Gabriel, just one question. Do you think Badiou, in a way, in some sense, is the thing that unifies this both sides? I'm not saying I'm against it, but I think every time you talk about this, the opposite side, I think you can just unify them when you talk about Badiou.
Yeah, and I do think that it's, I mean, it's weird because when you see his theory of these things, like he has a theory of social situations or situations in general, and a theory that allows you to think about the phenomenology of value and so on and so forth. And in the same book where he gives you these resources, he gives you a bunch of resources to think about in which sense organizations can be synthetic points of view that see more than you see. So at the philosophical abstract level, you do find a theory that talks about these two things together. But I think it's also too seductive and should be really kind of taken with a grain of salt, because we shouldn't be satisfied with a philosophical integration of stuff, especially coming from a philosopher who's totally against the very idea of political theory, like political philosophy. Like his whole point is that, you know, like it's very nice when philosophers kind of reconcile everything, but it's for politics that has absolutely no use. So the question, like you can imagine the solution philosophically perhaps, but it's not the same as really constructing it politically, right? In the sense of, okay, but how do you think this? Only with tools that come from political thinking, from political practice, from political life, right? So I think this is a bit the issue, right? Like at this moment, we have a very, very kind of abstract bridge between this, and it's really informing both sides, but we still lack a more, let's say, intrinsic point of view, where these things can be integrated from within, not from without, right? So I think it's also a matter of being kind of careful with that sort of solution, right?
Yeah, I agree. Also, I think I don't know if you mentioned this before, but I think a good way to think about this distinction is like in Badiou's duality between knowledge and truth, right? Like knowledge being that which structures the world as it already is, and truth being like that which can change it or like go beyond it.
Yeah.
So there is already, I guess, like the connection in the sense that like when a truth is like when someone is like goes through with it, and then if there is a failure, like it's supposed to be, at least on an abstract level, right? It reintegrates itself within the form of knowledge. Yeah, and I think that's the key that we want to understand. I think.
Yeah, and I mean
how to do that.
Exactly. I think the whole point is that it is pretty amazing that the guy found a way to define these two things with the same formal apparatus. Like it's totally homogeneous. Like there is no qualitative distinction, but you still get the distinction, right? So you can think processes that reinforce something, and it can be very complex, and he makes sure to show that there are several properties that are very connected to, for example, a certain perspective on capitalism and so on. But he's also, I mean, without any qualitative distinction, without bringing anything from a sort of profound, authentic sense, but very practical and pragmatic, come up with the tools that go here and show that they are connected and they stem from the same place. But it's hard to kind of do something similar at the immanently political level, right?
Yeah.
And this actually connects to so I would say that this is the first issue, right? I mean, it's not enough to have like how to move from this sort of abstract unification to a political one. So at this level here, you can get like a theory of the subject organization and so on, and a theory of situations and worlds. But how do you reconstruct this here, right? So I think that this is the first issue, and it's interesting to see that there is this sort of duality being preserved throughout these things. At the same time, I think that an insight that is kind of below the surface of what we did this until now, and that part of the reason why I think that this outline was useful is that one way to, like, you can say, but this is the case everywhere. It's everywhere the case that intervention and theorization are separate. But that's not true, because there is a theory of intervention that is inherently connected with theory, which is called experimentation.
Mm.
A theory of an experiment is not separate from a theory, or to be more specific, from a model of a theory, right? On the contrary, you can almost say that an experiment is like the continuation of the model through other means. It is about intervening in the world, but it's the very transformation you make under certain parameters increases what you might know, right? So it suddenly seems like perhaps a half step from this general theory to a political issue would be to kind of realize that ultimately what Badiou does is to spell out a theory of experimentation that fits with several different fields, like what he calls generic procedures. Are pretty much like a very general theory of experimentation that you can talk about, like art experiments, love experiments, science experiments, and then you have a problem of in which sense, what is a political experiment, right? So this is already like a more precise formulation of how to integrate this into this. Well, if you could, for example, imagine political thinking as composed of part of it is about modeling or mapping, and part of it is about experimentation, but in its own terms, not let's say mimicking art or mimicking science, but in its own terms, you would get both sides kind of more connected, right? At this level.
Yeah, and I think it's good also that you critiqued a lot, you focused a lot on Hayek in particular, because it seems like the Austrian school is one case that actually bridged this gap pretty well. Like it's basically like the dominant ideology in most of the world today, right?
Yeah, I think that we both have seen
as much as we don't like it, but
yeah, but it's true. I mean, they do.
Yeah, they succeeded really well.
Yeah, they did tackle a real problem and not tackle like a false one. You might not have. The solution is crappy, but
yeah. And they also another thing is I think a big critique of a lot of like thinking on the left is it gets too stuck in theory often.
Yeah.
And people are like, oh, what are you talking about, all this stuff? Like you have to bring it back eventually.
Yeah, and I think that this is a real problem, because when you have this parallax between a theory and a practice, and you get all this sort of abstract, almost mystical or overly kind of demanding solutions, like, oh, if only we get the perfect theory of everything, then we can do something. That makes no sense. Yeah. Because how can we even know some of the stuff without intervening first? Right? And vice versa also. Oh, there is the theory of praxis. Like if I only act exactly in accordance to a theory, then things will work out. Like these are very weird theories of how, modeling a world and acting on it relates. Nowhere in the rest of, known human practices do we have such a ridiculous theory. Like artists don't think like, well, when I know all musical theory, then I will be able to compose something. you know, and you can still experiment, and it can lead musical theory further, but it doesn't have that place. In science, it's not about that as well. I mean, those two things are not like, well, fine, you have a theory of relativity. Now, what can you do in practice? Like, that question doesn't make sense, right? So in politics, we don't have anything that is analogous to that, to the sort of introjection of what it means to intervene, where interventions have an epistemological role, right? And I think this is part of the stuff that I've tried to develop with this text. Like, in which sense can we talk about the epistemological value of organization, right? Perhaps there are things about a very complex world that you can only understand once you try something out and you see what happens. If you try something out under certain parameters with certain care, some things might come up, right? So it's kind of trying to bring epistemology into political practice. And on the other side, I think that Dennis also did a lot of work in trying to show, well, but even what we call, you know, social dynamics or this sort of underlying structure, it's not really a structure in the sense of something static that is there just to be known. It's a form of knowing. So there is kind of a connection between these two things, right? And I think that it's kind of summarized in this graph that this idea that I wrote here. This little schema here, right? Because here you get this idea that you have social structure, and it has a certain level of complexity, size, so on and so forth, right? And you have, let's say, individual organization in some level. So we could call it experience, in the sense of, you know, things that fit our complexity and our size, right? And Hayek was one who said, you know, you never manage to fit this into your head. This will never work. You need price. Price is like how you get information about a structure that is more complex than your complexity, right? So
yeah, we talked about it as a compression scheme, right?
Yeah.
Way of compressing this information to a point where it can fit in the psychic organization.
Yeah, and you can then start coordinating, and you can, I mean, I think it's important to see also that this is not just a one-way route. Like, if this is, let's say, the mapping route, this then allows you to do this, right? Which is the coordinating route. Like, you can start coordinating actions that you would never be able to plan alone because you're following price. So for example, you can choose which thing to sell, right, to produce because of the competition of prices. You can use competition to know if you're over-exploiting or under-exploiting workers, things you couldn't decide based on experience. So let's say we lose to Hayek insofar as he has a theory where the means of mediating between our experience and political structure are not scientific, they are political, right? Whereas we kind of take this down and separate it into theory, which is the mapping, and separate it into practice, which is the coordinating side. And well, since we already separate them, we can never bring them together. Whereas price is both things at the same time. It tells you, it sends a signal from a social structure, and you can act on it at the same time, right? So finding a way, so that duality we were talking about, which is kind of like the duality between critique of political economy here and theory of political action, right? And the problems that are actually inverting these arrows, we can never solve. So for example, what is the Marxist theory of social coordination? Like, how do you plan to run an economy? That's kind of a lost question because it doesn't fit any of the two poles, right? Because it's a question of political economy that concerns the issue of action, like coordination. Or the inverse question, right? So I would say, let's say if we agree that, let's say, Hayek is here, putting price here, and price does this. And this as well, right? Because the more you use price, the more you reinforce social structure. You can imagine, you can put, let me just change the color here. You can then imagine that we divided this question into critique of political economy, which does the mapping, and political organization, which does the social coordinating. So there are two ways of bridging this gap here that fit nowhere and are absolutely essential questions. So a question that bridges these two things, for example, the question of economic coordination. We don't have an answer. And the opposite question, which is, what is the economic basis of political action? Like, don't you exploit militants? Aren't there, let's say, intrinsic laws and tendencies to political organization itself? We also don't have that. So we could say that the political economy of militancy, we don't know, and organization. Right. So, for example, as we were talking about, when it comes to explaining why organizations fail, we only have moral tools. We don't have strict, rigorous tools as we try to apply to political economy when we talk about, you know, tendencies and forms and things like this. None of this is available to discuss political organization. So you see, like, these sort of questions have no place. On the other hand, if you look at what conservative theorists do, since there is no problem in thinking about price as being these two things at the same time, right? A mapping mechanism, a coordinating mechanism, and something that stems from reality and reinforces it. They have no problem in thinking about, like, producing a lot of literature on management, what it means to create an organization that coordinates with the rest of the world. So this is totally integrated in a more conservative perspective, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is maybe a bit of a side tangent a little bit, but when you guys mentioned before thinking about getting into mathy things, thinking about measure spaces and things, I was thinking about this more actually, and I saw in that topology paper from Joyal, there's this idea that a measure space is a frame when you exclude all of the things that are measure zero, that have no measure. So I think one way that you could think of a measure space as being something like value, because you're making choices of what counts, right? And then that gives you a whole structure, and it gives you a frame that's a tautological structure. You say, okay, maybe this thing is valued, and I can compare how much, like, grain, I can say this amount of grain is worth more than this amount of grain or whatever. But then price becomes the measure itself, the number, right, that you assign to, like, a volume of something, but it sort of makes everything the same, right?
Yeah. I think it totally integrates. I mean, for example, in the way that we've been talking about this, we've seen that, for example, Badiou would talk about social organization as a world that has a transcendental. We've been trying to talk about, like, how do I derive from the theory of the transcendental a theory of, you know, a specific metric that is kind of allows us to probe into this space, right? But might have, let's say, some commitment to particular forms of predication or covering of that space, which are commensurate with ourselves. I think psychic here is perhaps a bit too specific, because, I mean, I'm a psychoanalyst, so there's a problem there, but still something at our scale, right? So we see that there is some tools there to start bridging this sort of problem, right? And I think, for example, to also catch on a different strand of this whole thing, I think what we find in Marx, and I think Raquel convinced me of this recently much more, is that for example, if we say here that price is works like this for Hayek, actually it works like this for Marx. Like in Marx, you have something like, you might say value is here as a sort of transcendental category, but once he describes this whole reality, he also talks about how it's fully recasted by a theory of prices of production, which is kind of a way of recovering everything you already saw, and it respects those two lines that I just drew, because prices of production stem from social organization. They also reinforce it, and they also, let's say, represent it and allow for capitalists to coordinate through competition and equalization, right? So there is a theory of this much later on in Marx, right? Which is not, let's say, it's not simply what he says about value in the first volume when he says, oh, but once you measure value through a particular commodity, then that's price. End of story.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a lot also to work into, because if Marx has all these tools, it's already, let's say, perhaps halfway there as well, right? But again, it's not a general theory. It's a theory of, let's say, covering up the very social structure that is organized around value with something that is totally unilateral, because it only represents this reality from the capitalist perspective.
Yeah, in some sense, I was just going to point out that doesn't this mean that there's actually two transformation problems happening, right? It's the transformation of value into prices, but there's also a transformation of the psychic organization part into this formal organization.
Yes. I mean, this is why I added this other text here, which we never discussed that much, and I didn't add it in the summary. But this text I wrote was an attempt to find something which is missing in Badiou, like the reason why you cannot bridge these two problems with a theory, just with a general theory, abstract, philosophical kind of belief, because it's a text about the material conditions for mappings, right? So the whole text, let's see if they added here oh my God, it's, oh no, okay, it's here. I thought I didn't have access to the text. That would be amazing. So it's just like discussing absolute surplus value, blah blah blah. But then I get to the problem of enclosure of the commons, which is a long classic theme in Marxism about how land, labor, and money are fictitious commodities that need to be, the state needs to kind of mediate their inclusion into the commodity form because they're not produced by labor, right? And then I try to show that there is actually a fourth enclosure, which is the enclosure which affects more, let's say, if I can find it, the actual point here. See if this is visualizable. Which is the sort of what I divided it into 4 enclosures. So you have land enclosure, which is, let's say, the enclosure of external nature. You have the sort of, let's say, internal enclosure, enclosure of, for example, you no longer have the means to reproduce yourself. So the quality of health, the quality of the social reproduction of laborers is also turned into commodities. So you don't have the means to reproduce yourself as a laborer in the way that you want, but you're obliged to buy back stuff. So even and these are the way that Zizek talks about this in contemporary situation, but you can get it from that, right? The idea that the means to reproduce yourself as a natural being are also enclosed. That's the enclosure of labor, in fact, right? The dispossession of the means to reproduce you as a worker. Now, the conditions of your survival are external to you, right? Then there is, let's say, what Zizek calls the commons of internal culture, or of culture, and I divided them into two, which is the fact that knowledge needs to be enclosed into property form in order to be sold and bought, because knowledge doesn't have a commodity form to begin with, right? But then I came up with an added thing, which is the idea that once you have structural unemployment as a sort of background of society, you can no longer tell apart in any qualitative sense between the resting time of leisure and I don't know how you say this in English, like ocean, like when it's free time, right? And when you're in the unemployed time. And when you cannot tell these two things apart, and they are two things that come together, right? Structural unemployment destroys the means to kind of have access to free time at the same time that it segregates society more than in a class system. So surplus population leads to segregation of the social space that is much more radical. You undo the two conditions for, let's say, the experience of estrangement, right? The idea that you're gonna put yourself in a position that is outside of you, and it's a productive experience, right? So if you don't have free time, every time has a function. And if the social structure, the public space is destroyed, and there is no place where you can experience other social groups in a non-threatening way, you lose two of the main conditions to, let's say, estrange yourself in this sort of thing here.
Which two conditions?
Having free time, meaning a time that doesn't have a particular function.
Mm-hmm.
So all time is, let's say, reference back to you. Well, what is it? What are you going to do with that time? And experiencing the position of someone else in a way that is not useful to you, right? You could perhaps talk about it in those two terms.
Okay.
To adopt the perspective of a mediation, right? Rather than seeing the world like this, to displace this and see the world like this, right? You need to be able to do something which is not useful to you, and you must be able to let's say, to think about what it means to be in a position of otherness to you, right? So structural unemployment is a kind of makes the idea of unusefulness or uselessness kind of out of the picture, because useless time is just time that's waiting to go back to labor. And there is no experience of being in a space where you're not, let's say, the perspective from which you're seen, which is the public space, right? So let's say these material conditions to develop or to have the means to kind of, how do you call it? Not support, but like to bear, to be out of place in this way. Yeah, sustain this out of placeness. They're out of the picture. And I think that there's a very concrete sense of this, which is, well, the more militancy becomes contradictory with your time. So for example, to develop a political organization, you need time.
Yeah.
Well, but if you don't have free time, you can't do it, right? So there are, let's say, this move here, it has conditions. This thing here conditions how much you can do this thing here, right? So depending on how society is structured, you can have societies that kind of almost prevent this from happening or oblige this from happening in new ways, right? And what I try to show in the text is that kind of statistically, you can see that the less you need to bridge your space, the less time it takes, or the less contradiction with useful time, and the less different others or really different people are involved, the more people are able to do this. So let's say mathematics, which you can do as a profession and alone, you're able to displace yourself to the position of a formal apparatus and think with its rules rather than your intuitive rules, right? Art, which can still have valorization Like it can still go up in value, even if you are doing something which is useless and doesn't take many people together. It also still can be a perspective from which to see the world. Like you still are able to put yourself under the ruling of the artwork, right? In love, people can still sometimes, displace themselves to and think about the couple and think about the relationship and not only about themselves. But in politics, this is so contradictory with useful time. It takes so much time, so much energy. The political economy of militancy makes it kind of unbearable.
And also
right?
the scale is so large, right?
Yeah, and the scale is so
Compared to
large.
the other
Exactly.
thing.
So you see, like you can start not only thinking about these things here, but you can also think about this, right? As Dennis was putting, like it's not only a matter of developing a mediation that is materially made of our situation, but perhaps points to something else, points to a larger space, and shows that this is just one solution and there are others, right? Things that are possible. And also that, at the same time, it allows you to map the world and to coordinate action based on it, but it needs to also respect this sort of constraints, right? This is what makes it political, that all these arrows come from politics. None of them come from philosophy. You can use any field you want, but in the end, they cannot be qualitatively distinct. Like all of this is like a beautiful philosophical book you wrote. Like, no, it needs to all be made of the same stuff. That's why I wrote here in terms of everything can be thought in terms of organization. Social organization constrains your individual experience, which also constrains the organization of mediation, right? Which are also constrained by this. So these things can also all be thought as being kind of made of the same stuff ultimately, right?
Yeah, I was going to point out that the theory of the market already has a name for the constraint between individual or psychic organization and maybe between social, but the theory would be like game theory, right? Or these kinds of economic behavioralist theories, which kind of preclude the possibility for certain types of politics.
Yeah,
right?
like it's all like rational choice theory and stuff.
Exactly. Like from that perspective, it's rationally, it doesn't make sense to
waste
organize.
Time, for example.
Yeah, waste time, like come together and like talk about something that doesn't immediately, lead to, better wages or better, like it can make sense of, let's say, labor unions to some extent, because, a union might end up, getting you paid more, but it can't really make sense of other forms of organization that don't like directly get that raising of the wages or something like that. So I think there's something there too. I think it falls into the notion of complexity that Apolito's text goes into, which is like people organize to reach higher levels of complexity so that they can think or do things that they normally wouldn't do, right? And that's not captured in this game theory perspective. I mean, you can loosely say, like, game theory always has like an escape hatch, because they say, well, your personal preference can be anything you want, so we don't need to specify what it is. It could be money, it could be art, it could be whatever, like learning. And let's just, the notion of utility is supposed to be broad.
Yeah, it's underdetermined at that point, right?
Undetermined.
Apparently.
Yeah, but still, even though they leave it undetermined, this game theoretic thing doesn't seem to be able to handle certain forms of organization.
And I think that Apolito's idea is interesting, because what I think she does is to say, like, look, we can think of this as a bigger thing. Like, you have something here of a certain level of complexity, but a theory of complexity in general actually allows for you to imagine something else here, right? And then you can think, okay, I know that prices and markets, they lead here, right? she's not saying that this is not consistent, but she's saying, well, I can still imagine something that does this, right? To some other thing here, and that goes there. And you, in a theory of complexity, something that allows you to think of this as a case. And you can think of something as a different solution that perhaps is more attuned to those conditions, right? Though this part here she takes as solved, right? She says anarchists, like the small scale stuff I'm taking as kind of already solved. And the problem is how to coordinate these things, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I think it's a good example of the same idea, right? Focusing on the idea that you can kind of, rather than think like the preferred term for her is not organization, but complexity, right? And complexity then allows you to talk about this and as part of something bigger, allows you to talk about this as also something that can have other forms, right? Because you can kind of grade organizations in a homogeneous, rigorous way from the perspective of complexity, right? And then she calls this the small scale. And she's interested in these arrows. But she doesn't really go into this, right?
Yeah, and so like the idea of political experiments are almost like always ways of scaling up this small scale.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you need, I mean, I think experiments they're not kind of bound to a particular scale, right? I mean, there are experiments which are national, experiments which are very small, and we know that different things can only be seen from different scales. Not everything can be seen from everywhere, right?
Oh, okay, yeah.
So, for example, I think that it's also a matter of considering that this thing here is, let's say, it has multiple scales like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't need to think of perhaps one thing here. You can imagine it as having like things like this, which already exist, let's say. There are ways of picturing the world that only take one of these slices, right? So, for example, a certain communitarian view, which is mediated by a sort of interpersonal code, it maps the world for people. A sort of state-based approach that has the contract and property and laws as a mediation also mapped to people in a certain way, right? And for example, value here, it has its own price mediation that also maps stuff to people here. These two things are not necessarily so clearly kind of reducible one to another, perhaps, right? So, but I think that this helps to see why I separated these particular things here, right? Because so the problem is, if we assume that one way to imagine the passage from Badiou to something more immanently political is through the fact that, you know, most forms of thinking that are autonomous, they include in a sort of more integrated way an interventionist point and a theoretical point. Like these two things are more immanently tied. We could think that, you know, understanding better, understanding experiments in the most general sense might be a good kind of intermediary point to talk about this, right? And for example, with this in mind, that's why I separated here two things, which is Robert Rosen's work, because Robert Rosen was a guy who he uses the same machinery as Badiou. He uses category theory and not so much topos theory, but his whole point, his issue is very similar to ours. His issue was, I'm a biologist and I realized that biologists don't know how to experiment. Like we imitate experiments from other disciplines, And we don't really, because we have a problem, which is the analytic method of dividing a whole into its parts, makes us lose the very thing we're trying to understand, which is the whole that is, let's say, together with the parts. So we want to understand the organization of a living system, but the only way we know how to experiment with that organization is by undoing it, right? And he says, well, his main insight is that we need to rethink what is a scientific model in such a way that mechanistic models, which are based on state spaces, become a subclass of possible modeling. Because for him, biological systems cannot be modeled by the idea of states, because that commits us to the priority of parts over the whole. So even if you have dynamical system analysis and things like this, ultimately you're just like displacing the problem to statistic mechanics and nonlinear dynamics and things like this, but you're still kind of talking in the language of mechanics ultimately. Just
why is that so that it becomes when you just focus on states, it becomes only about the parts, not the whole?
His point.
Connection.
I mean, I'm definitely not well versed enough in his work, but
Mm-hmm.
his main point is that there is a commitment in the modeling strategies of physics in the 20th century to
Mm-hmm.
a certain, let's say, like a certain primacy of recursion, and like the very idea that you can move from chronicles of data to a formalism that actually captures something, for example, of how you move from one proposition to another.
Mm-hmm.
Right? For him, that at that very level, the very fact that you're moving from one proposition to the other via a certain rule that is immanent to a formalism, right? And that this is turning those chronicles, right, where you have, let's say, distance and time or whatever, into a more immanent description. That always preserves this idea that somehow the parts, you understand the whole by understanding the parts.
Mm.
Even if, let's say, your definition of parts is statistical and you get some sort of renormalization of a bunch of particles into some kind of statistical stability or whatever analysis. So for him, this was never really developed, and he says, well, I want to think, I want to use the means of category theory to reframe what is a system that has the properties of a living system. And so he develops in one book first, this book here, this one, sorry, Fundamentals of Measurement and Representation in Natural Systems. He formulates the problem of what it means to experiment. And then 20 years later, he came up with the fact that you cannot simply define experiments for biological systems. You need to redefine what models are, with where organization has a primacy over states. So this is one of the lines that I personally think is relevant, simply for the fact that at least it poses some problems concerning how can you generalize a theory of experiments to something, to other phenomena, and using means that are very similar to Badiou. In fact, weirdly enough, he has a crusade against the state, like Badiou. So there's also that. And the second kind of this Robert Rosen guy, and the second guy is John Barwise. Though this is a very large field today, and he's by no means the only guy studying this. John Barwise was a guy who, together with another guy, I forget, a Japanese guy, he wrote a couple of texts in the 80s with this idea of surrogate reasoning, which later on, I think it's kind of, actually not later on, but in tandem, it was developed by David Chalmers as the idea of the extended mind, right? But it's an analysis, a certain approach to modeling and logical and logical processes that suggest that, let's say, some reasonings can only be done outside of us. So it's kind of like you have you here, right? And you have some problems, and different mediations might be better to solve those problems than you. And they try to define what are the things that make, for example, certain mediations more prone to solve a problem than others. So it's the idea that you kind of delegate the reasoning to something else, because that thing has the means to think something better than you have, right? So it kind of has that same structure we were talking about, where you have here some small scale, some organization of complexity level 1, and you have a problem that's for some reason here you can't really get your mind around, or it's for some reason not in your measure, right? And he says, well, there are different mediators here that make this problem more tractable, and he wants a theory of this thing. So in which sense is the logical space of this similar to this to make this possible, the delegation? And in which sense is this system more similar to this that makes this possible?
So it's like moving between scales.
Yeah, so he doesn't talk about scales necessarily, but he does talk about, for example, very, very stupid examples. He goes from very stupid to very sophisticated ones, like you want to remember something, but like just trying to remember where you were when you were a kid might be not a good way of organizing your memory, because, for example, your head is capable of superimposing two propositions at the same place. So you can say John lived next door and Sarah lived next door. But if you actually draw on a piece of paper your street, and you draw houses, and you write John lives next door to me, you blocked the possibility that Sarah lives next door. So the very constraints of drawing are adding bonus information that if you were doing it on your own, you wouldn't be able to get, right? So you get some freebies, and so you get both freebies, and that's actually the term that he uses. You get freebies, and you get, let's say, what's the name of the person who goes with, he's not driving, but he comes with you in the car.
A chauffeur?
No, like,
oh, no, chauffeur is the driver.
Yeah, like you, a hitchhiker.
Passenger?
Right?
Hitchhiker,
like somebody who you don't get something for free, but you give something too much for free. You know, like somebody who takes advantage. So
like a free rider.
Yeah, free rider. It's like in the Menker Olsen thing. And free rider problems, because on the other hand, drawing is two-dimensional. So it might impose a constraint that is not interesting, right? So some constraints will give you free information, and some constraints will remove the possibility of information, right? So he starts talking about this. Okay, so you have something you want to know, and some stuff will have a good economy of freebies and free riders, right? Which will make it bad for some stuff, but really good for other stuff. And they try to develop this idea. So again, it seems to me that it's a sort of it's the sort of approach to the whole thing of cognitive mapping, right? That also concern a sort of, it has a certain relation to experimentation, in the sense that, for example, you can have a theory of experiments as a form of surrogate reasoning. Well, if you want to know, for example, how a certain complex system is going to behave, well, you cannot solve it only, let's say, through some equations. Like the equations are too complex, right, to deal with it directly. So you simulate it. Like you construct, for example, like like some people did when they were planning. And there's a really good example of this. I forgot. I think it was in California, like this huge dam, and the guys constructed a smaller scale of the dam and run a bunch of tests on it just to see how it would behave. Right. So an actual physical model in that situation was a better way to reason through the problem, right? To extract information from it, than if they just tried, let's say, to come up with an abstract example and solve equations for it, for example, or something like this, right? Approach it just abstractly. So depending on so kind of like experiments, you can generalize them to both thought experiments and physical experiments and simulations and things like this, with as different instantiations of a way of delegating reasoning to something that reasons better than you. I mean,
and price is a good example of that. Right?
Exactly, price would be exactly something like this, and we can think price in terms of both freebies and free riders, right? It does make something. It does give you something for free because the very fact that it is fluctuating and so on, and it's unstable, it's also, let's say, giving you a ripple of something very big, right? But on the other hand, it doesn't bring, like, there's a lot of information that is lost. And it has a bunch of other issues and so on and so forth. So, I mean, that's why I separate, I thought that these two texts kind of have something to do with discussing this. And in fact, it's very interesting because in the last 10, 20 years, a whole bunch of books on philosophy of experimentation came out. Like, if you look into the bibliography, it's crazy how people are saying, okay, perhaps we've stopped wondering what experiments are. So there's a lot of material on that, right? And I think that this is connected with this issue as well. Because another thing that we've been talking about and that goes into this issue that, I mean, I think complexity seems to be like also an abstract term that binds everything together without perhaps doing, like, finding enough singularity on the points, because you can bind together, okay, price is a matter of complexity, and complexity is already a matter of, you know, surrogate reasonings and different scales, right? But it's interesting to see the sort of these things kind of separately. And again, in that little drawing we were talking about, you know, you have this, you can kind of make this as a sort of homogeneous schema because everything can be thought in terms of organization, and then heterogeneous in terms of scale, right? You can almost talk about like large, small, and medium, right? Something that like bridges a gap, something that needs that gap to be bridged because it's too small, like there's something transitive here, right? But at the same time, you don't want to be essentialist about this because it's not always that it is an individual who needs to coordinate. Like, companies need to coordinate, and companies are not so small, and countries. So in a certain sense, you don't want to commit to any level, because what you call the thing that is disjunct from the other. So if this is structure that you want to know or something like this, the thing that is here that you're considering the experience, these things might be disjunct in many different ways, like global economy and a person, but also global economy and I don't know, or a city and a small organization, or a company and something else, right? You don't need to define, like, just because you call something local and global, for example, doesn't mean that you define what is the local scale and what is the global scale, right? They're kind of relative to each other, and this also defines what this is. So for example, you can even, again, going back to physics, you can imagine, okay, you can still have a whole slice of reality at a sort of average human scale, and you can, it's still unknowable to our experience, right? But some sort of experiments, like with mechanical systems and things like this, are able to probe into this space, like where this slice is pretty much Euclidean, right? But now imagine like a huge slice of this, like on a cosmic scale, trying to understand like how light bends through stars. Like, this is no longer Euclidean, and you also need totally different sort of experiment for this, right? So you don't need to commit to the idea that this is one thing that is always the same, nor that these things here are always transitive, right? That they're always the same. So, and I also think it's good to stress that we're kind of taking parts of Badiou and trying to find more ordinary or more politically motivatable versions, because we have this problem in the whole discussion of the atomic logic and, you know, exactly what counts as the sub-object for a given world, and this can change from world to world. There's no essential scale that is thought to be, let's say, the basic brick of any given reality. You have here the problem of, okay, how can we think about, you know, extending, organizing something so that we can extend our reach beyond what's already known in a way that also shifts our perspective from our own private experience to something objective. It's kind of weird, right?
Yeah, I think also one thing, scale, I think is an important and a good way to think about it, as opposed to like complexity, which I think we've seen before. But because I think complexity falls for the same, I guess, like pitfall that that price does, right? It's just a measure of something. So ultimately, it shows you how much of something there is.
Yes.
It doesn't give anything qualitative about it.
Yes, I think that's a really good
Just
point.
a quantity,
like,
yeah.
Yeah, it always keeps structure in a black box.
Yeah.
It measures some degree of it, some quantity, but it's not necessarily, let's say, really giving you insight into what you're doing. Though, of course, I mean, I think it's much better to arrive at complexity problems from scaling issues, structural discussions, than to try to go the inverse, right? Though I think that rhetorically, and not only rhetorically, but Apolito's text is really good because it already gives like a immanently political version of these problems, right? Just by adopting this perspective, I think. And then I think that, so if these are, let's say, the two big formal issues, I think, right? On the one hand, like I would say that this is also connected, but these three here are more clearly, like these are more scientific in a certain sense. But this here, I think that these two here are the ones that are, these two things need to kind of fall into this at some point, right? So this thing is something that Dennis has been working already on. Okay, how can we, and it's, I mean, one thing that's worth mentioning is that at least with Rosen and so on, you get this thing here already being treated categorically. This is already being treated by this whole kind of compositionality discussions on applied category theory and how to this for behavioral mereology, and these things are pretty much discussing, let's say, how can we think about things purely from constrained passing, and which is already kind of a mix of this issue, right, with an issue of, for example, Eric Hole's work, which I've been looking into recently, and it's very interesting, his ideas of for certain systems, the causal model that is most information rich is the large scale one, not the base scale one. Like when you have a microstate description of a system with multiple parameters, and you get a large scale description where these multiple parameters are valued, like are warped into one parameter. And if you measure the channel capacity of in terms of this has more bits than this. So the large model captures more information than the lower scale model of the same system, which is kind of counterintuitive, right? That's why he says the map is better than the territory. So it's already kind of an idea that sometimes, like, you need to be scale sensitive about what is, let's say, the causal ground of a system, right? And it's, again, dealing with a bunch of similar tools. So the moment that we start getting the same tools to talk about these things here, as Dan is already doing here, I think that it becomes easier also to imagine how these things can be integrated, right? And I think that this is also, like I added this as a separate thing just because there is also kind of a parallel line of development where these same issues are being treated by some people who already define some, let's say, they basically already are working with a pre-schema which says you have individual ventures here, or individual and collective ventures, right? You have social structure here, and what you want here ultimately is a computational interface. And this is what can solve it, right? So guys like Paul Cockshott, and in a certain sense, this is kind of what Apolito is suggesting, that this is the means to deal with this, right? Like nothing prevents us from coming up with a sort of informational interface that captures the complexity of this much better than price could ever do or markets could ever do. And this is will make markets kind of obsolete, right? So I think that this is another line of engagement that is open, which is, okay, what has been done on these fronts? And I think especially Paul Cockshott's development, there are many people who we pushed in this direction. This is a book by him where he pretty much spells out this view of, okay, the socialist calculation problem is treatable if you have enough computational power and if you have the right modeling for it. So we don't need to change our presuppositions about social structure. We can keep the same. Labor produces wealth through collective organization of the means of production, blah, 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 just as it is today, but we can bypass kind of markets and the capitalist class, right? And you have, let's say, the slightly more adventurous version that Apolito presents, but that shares a lot of stuff with it as well, I think. Then I think that we have the more, let's say, the things that come from the other side, right? Things that are not coming from, let's say, trying to bring Badiou down to the political level, but things that are coming from politics and trying to go up, right? Which is recasting Marx in a certain sense, trying to find categories that we can use to facilitate this project. And I think that we have kind of three main things today on this level. Like this part here deals with critique of political economy and what it means to destroy the way that it's currently constructed and reconstruct it in terms that are compatible with everything we're saying, right? This thing here is a sort of intermediate thing in this process because Karatani pretty much gives a theory of social worlds and capitalist social formation that is very concrete on the one hand, but it kind of already does half of the stuff we want, because it's a theory where social formations and political action is made of the same thing, which is four logics that are connected or mixed together. So he says a social formation is made of four logics, which he defines as A, B, C, and D. And the thing we want is also another thing made of these four things. So the parameters are the same. Like you don't need two theories. You'll have only one theory that gives a view of world economy and of something else. It's the same theory. It's not two theories. So it's kind of a step in that direction. And we've been discussing this. It's very cogent with Badiou's own project. So what this guy calls a world, which is absolutely historical and political, kind of shares the same basic constraints and basic definitions of what Badiou calls a world. So it could be kind of how to call it, a shortcut, right, for this. one thing that I've been thinking about is that there is this whole work on multi-layer networks. And since Karatani thinks of a social formation as a sort of mix of different logics that are kind of independent of each other, but at the same time interconnected, it seems like if you were to try to bridge this to a more categorical approach and Badiouian approach, you perhaps would need something that allows you to talk about a transcendental as many networks kind of congeal together in a certain sense. So I've been kind of flirting with this idea, but it kind of fits in that broad theme of bringing from politics, like trying to reframe something political in terms that bring us back to bring us closer to that other view that coming from top down, right? From making it less abstract as well. And I think that these are two things here. I think, Dennis, did you add this one?
Yeah.
Is this Bob Cook?
Related. I think it's by someone. It's kind of a survey text compiling all these different.
Oh my God!
languages.
Like, I totally missed that. Okay.
Yeah. Let's see. I can share my screen.
Sure.
Oh, I'm not a host.
This can be solved in.
Congrats, Dennis. You're the co-host now.
Oh,
You're the co-host.
amazing.
Can I make everyone a co-host?
Probably, yeah.
Graph. Let me find this text again.
Wow, we've been given the rights by Gabriel.
Zoom democracy.
It's actually
Zoom-
mode B.
Zoom
It's mode B
communism.
because he he accumulated the rights and now he's distributing the rights.
Yes.
Yeah.
In exchange for fidelity and loyalty.
Yeah, we can basically just skip to. So I was just looking at specifically Marx's schemas for social reproduction. You know how he like does all that stuff with like department 1, department 2, and then like tries to show how you can reproduce society by taking the output of one department and using that as the input of the other one, right? Department 1 representing like the stuff that the department that produces means of production, and department 2 produces means of consumption or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That whole schema, I think we can formulate with category theory using these monoidal categories. And I actually haven't really dug into this text because it's kind of a compilation of all the different types of monoidal categories and what each one offers in terms of the diagrams that you can draw.
Braids.
Yeah, like braided categories and crazy stuff that I haven't
I wonder
had
if
the time
that
to
has anything to do with braids and topology. That's something I studied a bit.
Oh yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think Joyal came up with these, so there's some connection. Yeah, I'm sure there's some topological crazy.
The only thing I saw of this was Bob Cook
Oh, there you go.
teaching how to make a recipe. with
Yeah,
monoidal.
Yeah, the 7 sketches and also Bob Koch guy, they have really more accessible examples. So if you look at like the language itself is very concise. The generators here are just like, these are the pieces that are allowed, right? So like 2 things becoming 1 thing. I think this is like identity, I'm not sure. And then this one is splitting. And then you can actually assign elements from some other category, or it can, in this case, it's just from the real numbers. You can assign values to things, right? And then they obey these rules. So you can kind of string together quite nice little flow diagrams. But that's kind of what I wanted to get to with when we talk about values flowing out of one department into another one, right? Because the way Marx sees it is it's all kind of a flow diagram, basically. and it just has to be good enough to, you know, reproduce society. So some of that labor gets used up in means of production, but just enough of it comes back in the means of consumption to, what is this? Yeah, just enough
like,
comes
sorry,
back. Yeah.
No,
I'm trying to find exactly this. There's one diagram specifically that is really good at showing this. Here it is. So like this one here, it's a pre-order. So pre-orders are like partial orders, which we've been discussing a lot. The only difference is you can kind of loop back, right? Whereas in a partial order, it's anti-symmetric, so you can't do this like less than when it goes back.
Yeah, because when it's a partial order, if it goes both ways, then they have to be equal.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, so
Exactly.
a pre-order is like just like a less than. Yeah.
Yeah,
Not
exactly.
less than
So
equal to, yeah.
yeah, pre-orders are nice because they exactly have this the structure we need to formalize Marx's reproduction schemas. So if you imagine less than being, you know, the flow of value, the direction that value flows in, we can kind of see like, you know, the inputs being, you know, the two departments, and then the outputs being means of production, means of consumption, something like that. So I wanted to, maybe this is a way we can tackle the transformation problem, or at least reformulate what Marx is doing in a way that it kind of opens us up to other mappings here, because so the whole point of this thing, I would say a big chunk of 7 sketches is going from this kind of diagram all the way to what they call functorial semantics, which is captured in this little chunk of the text where they say like, functorial semantics is a key manifestation of compositionality. It says that the matrix of this, which is a signal flow graph for G, the matrix meaning for a flow graph can be computed this way. And what that means is, given a flow graph, we can assign arbitrary values to it, not arbitrary, but certain values to it that are consistent in a way, similar to the way we talk about like sheaves and consistency of assigning data. This is like that for graphs. So you have a graph, and only certain assignments make sense, right, to that graph. Yeah, and so you get like, for example, you can do linear algebra using this graphical formalism.
Because I mean, the thing that I wanted to add, and now I'm just going to send you a text that I think is really, really interesting to go with that. But like, I think that it's the moment that you kind of look at this sort of investigation in light of the bigger picture. I think one thing is, because I think that it's, you know, it's kind of like taking there is a sort of weird exercise of that I think should at some point affect how we think about political economy, which I think we talked about this then, is like the moment that you try to express something about political economy, not, let's say, from the critique of it, by saying, for example, but something was left out, but there is a presupposition which is not being mentioned, but from this sort of broader framework we're trying to construct, where political economy is almost like a given form of social organization amongst others, right? Our current political economy. Is that if the tools are able to formalize this, but they're not made to formalize only this, you can always attach something else and see what happens.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? I think that's really, I mean, it's really a change in the grammar of how we discuss Marx and political economy. If you're able to formalize these categories, preserving their relation, but at the same time, with a language that is not restricted to those relations, not the language of those relations, right? So using my sovereign rights, can I just share my screen really quick?
Yeah.
This is like a really genius text by a great Marxist feminist called Diane Elson. it's an old text called the Economic, the Political, and the Domestic, right? And she talks about the basic social reproduction of, exactly as we're talking about, Marx' volume 2 of Capital and sectors, and how to differentiate and aggregate social activities in terms of sectors, so on. And for example, she talks about these circuits with this little diagram here. Where is it? Here. Sorry, is this the first one or the second one? Right, this is the, you can see like household, exactly as you were showing, right? Going to taxes to government, spending towards firms, exports, and so basically what she calls the circular flow of national money income, right? And then she said, well, this doesn't compute domestic labor. She was actually in the forefront a couple of years ago of calculating how much wealth is produced by domestic labor. It's like, I don't know how many trillions, right? And so you can actually kind of formalize in a more restrict way the thing that she does here, which is after she critiques this, she actually includes the domestic sector into it.
Mm.
So you kind of get a bigger picture with the same formalism, right? This is not I think this is a good example of something which is not a critical view. Because when you, I mean, you want to keep the impetus of critique, of saying something is more restrictive than it seems, right? The very idea of philosophical critique came from this. Like Kant was already saying, like, dude, you're not looking at actual stuff. You're looking at stuff codified by some parameters, right? Which are from your cognition. So critique has that impetus of saying you're restricting something that you're not seeing. But the problem is that critique is usually a movement that goes from the explicit expression of the constrained space and the sort of loose abstract expression of the things that were left out, right? So the things left out, they tend to be either treated as substantial or as fundamental or as a-changing or as mystical or something like this. They're never like reintegratable back into the picture because they're qualitatively distinct in a certain sense. Like what she's doing here is kind of expanding the view and saying, well, if you include this, suddenly the way that this other stuff here is governed makes no sense. And you can add other stuff to it, right? So I think that, like, I'm just saying this because I think this is a really complicated kind of exercise that especially people in the Marxist tradition like me have a hard time doing, which is not like forcing yourself not to make a shift in your language or your way of thinking when you move from describing social structure, political economy to talking about, you know, what it means to change something, what it means to, like, the way that you were talking about, and sorry for stealing the screen, right? The interesting thing is to always look for formalisms where you could, for example, add something that you don't really know how it functions, could see what it could do, perhaps, and then say, well, if it looks interesting, we could try it, right? Like, that's not critical. That's, let's say, substituting the critique of political economy for a sort of experimental view of it. Because you can already include, like, interesting unknowns, right? Let me try something in this. What would it affect? It probably would affect this and that. Okay, so this might be an interesting thing to be tried rather than that, even if you don't know if it's true. But suddenly the things like the intervention and the knowing, they become more immanently coupled together, right? Mm-hmm. I think that there is a sort of grammar, like a way of thinking about this thing that is very uncommon. Like, it's part of the fantasy of Marxists that you need to wait until you gain power in order to experiment something else. But because of this, you never experiment with the things that could lead you to get some power. So you kind of get stuck. So it's interesting to kind of, you know, to choose this sort of formalism, also because they do more than to capture the stuff we already know, right? And I think that sort of thing that you were talking about now, it's interesting in that sense as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think it gives us a nice way to also locate this debate between, let's say, Paul Cockshott and what I think that in that one text you sent me, he calls it like the value form theorists. I think Heinrich would be a good example. I think so. Heinrich's position is that you can't really calculate labor. You can't really treat labor time as quantifiable basis for value. So it's not like Heinrich's whole point is you can't simply replace prices with labor times and get like a good vision of what is happening in society.
Yeah.
Where Paul Cockshott has a very nice ambition, right? Which is to say that, like, I'll share again, because in his project for or whatever towards the New Socialism book, he says here, right, like, we are proposing a system of computerized planning which involves the simulation of the behavior of the economy in great detail. And then so he actually wants to go for this like central planning with computers and using, how long it takes to make everything, right? All the data that you would need to exactly calculate like allocation problems. Yeah, so I think when we talk about this debate between value as this kind of something too big to be calculated versus, so if we take Heinrich's position, it seems almost like a good position because he is acknowledging that value is too big. But then we lose out on the experimental aspect, which I think.
Yeah, it seems like it's not even worth trying anything, right?
Yeah, like then where are you? So you're saying you can never calculate anything differently. So all calculation is inherently capitalist in some sense. But I think Paul Cockshott shows like, well, we just need a different set of metrics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
With a different set of metrics, we can take something productive out of value. And I think this is more in the spirit of Marx himself, right? But yeah, I don't know. Like the ideas of the department 1, department 2 schemas and so on.
No, I think that these are very, and I think this is really crucial because the way that I would say that like in the thing we were talking about before, right? There is some movement that we're trying to make, which is going from Badiou, which has this kind of theory of subject here and a theory of situations here, and they are combined. We're trying to go from this down, right? And we're trying to come from politics here, where we currently have, let's say, theory of organization here and critique of political economy here, right? And they are actually apart. And we're trying to do like this stuff. And this is kind of the space where we're at, right? But I think that one thing that we need to do also is to consider that many of the attempts at coming here that currently exist, they are kind of framed, they have, let's say, spontaneous philosophies. They're not necessarily this one that we're interested in, right? So for example, from the current Marxist debates, either from the Spinozian interpretation or from the Hegelian interpretation or from the Kantian interpretation, which makes sense to be like the basic frameworks because that's what we have, right? It's very hard to kind of settle that issue. For example, Heinrich will say, abstract labor is not measured by clock. Mm-hmm. And Cockshott will say, no, it's absolutely measurable by clock. Like, it's a concrete thing. It's just like, so I would even say like, it's not that Heinrich is a guy who thinks value as a transcendental. Like, it's not a matter of an average, a statistical average, or a specific attractor of socially necessary labor time, the mean time for production. Like the mean time is an approximation of value. It's not itself value. Whereas Cockshott will say, no, it is value. Like that's the physical, more sound interpretation. And you are unable to get like from Cockshott's perspective, it's like you get things become tractable, because being too large just means being too complex. Doesn't mean being something that is not complexity itself. It's something else, right? So value becomes a problem of tractability of complexity. On one hand, you lose something from that idea that value is more than this, because for Heinrich, the fact that it's transcendental in a certain sense, or that is, let's say, a sort of framework and not simply the averaging of some quantity, he is able to explain social tendencies and not only economic ones based on it. So he's able to talk about other stuff based on this. So other things are trying to measure value, and not only prices, right? So forms of life, there's a whole theory of a social theory that stems from it, right? And on the other hand, so if you get one perspective, like the Heinrich or value theory perspective, you kind of get a feel for the idea that you need to change something very fundamental. So it's not a matter of simply changing how you measure a certain space, but changing the space being measured, right? With Cockshott, but then it's kind of intractable and seems like impossible to experiment with. Or you get the Cockshott version, which is, well, the thing is just a very large, complex thing. There is no underlying kind of structure to it. If you get better at the econometrics of it, you already solve the problem, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this seems to go back to, I guess, like the problem of scale, right? It seems like the kind of like cybernetics approach has like almost like a univalent, I guess, like assumption built into it, right? Like if you just think of like complexity it's just like the complexity of the whole system. And there seems to be a little of this like bias towards central planning as well, right? Which
Yeah,
I think thinking of scale, I think, can sort of overcome that a little bit, potentially.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, one thing that I was talking to Dennis about the other day is, I mean, isn't it assuming a bit too much that, I mean, we were talking about this in the context of a recent text that I translated from Badiou. Dennis, let me steal your screen again.
Yeah.
Sorry. This passage that he talks about this concept from large cardinal theory called these ultra filters, right? Non-principal ultra filters. And he makes this distinction between, it really clarified something for me. He says, well, let's say you have a really, really, really huge class, right? And you want to be able to measure it. Like you can think of it of different forms of measuring it in terms of the sort of covering that it allows for. So some really, really large infinities allow for this thing called a principal ultrafilter, which is like really large covers of space, like this, that have some singleton element here in common. So you get to have, like, if you're able to have very large parts, and if you know that these large parts intersect at one point, so if all of this together, you will know that you have a certain size for your space, for this infinity, right? And he says, well, but there is another size of infinity, which is even bigger, which allows for what he calls this non-principal ultrafilter, which is ultrafilters that cover things in this way. So for example, this intersects in a different point, this intersects at a third point, and this intersects at a fourth point, right? So, and this is a large part, and this is another large part, this is a third large. So if, let's say, if you can prove that you have large intersections plus large parts in a singleton as an intersection, you know a certain cardinality. If you can prove that you have large parts and you don't have one intersection without this one singleton, then you know that this cardinality is actually bigger than this one. Mm-hmm. Right? So there is a really crazy proof for this. But then it got me to realize that I mean, we talk about money as being decentralized, but it is kind of like a way of covering everything. It covers everything separately, but it does cover it under the same form, right? Everything needs to be localizable as one specific thing, right? Like this. It's true that these things here can be totally incommensurate and totally different. Like, you're not trying to, let's say, cover everything at once. It still allows for infinite heterogeneity, but everything still needs, like, it's decentered at the level of authority, right? But it's actually centered at the level of form. You still have formally the idea that everything passes through something, right? Some one homogeneous thing. And again, this is where Heinrich and Cockshott disagree. Is this an average? Like, is this some like stability that is just averaging, or is this like a transcendental, or like a actually kind of imposed form on everything, right?
Yeah, it seems that right. So this is like how price works, but price sort of does this to everything, right?
Yeah.
But it does seem like that if you sort of, I guess, like separated this sort of principal ultrafilters between scales, that could be something that's a lot, I think, more like, it seems to like we talk about how price as this like universal equalizer where sort of like everyone's like the marketplace. I want to say marketplace of ideas, but I guess just just the marketplace itself. But it seems that like this could still be a useful thing at particular scales. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I
where
think
like a scale is sort of like, I guess, like a localized world in some way. It's not really rigorous, but
no, I think that this is a bit what we were talking about. Like, still the idea of, let's say, substituting price for an informational system. It actually does the same thing. It remains decentered in terms of authority, but it remains centered in some other sense. Like, you could still explore the possibility, as you were saying, that, let's say, A and B exchange in accordance to like the intersection between their value systems is one. Then B exchanges with C and the intersection is something else. And these two things might actually be defined by different scales. Like, this is an exchange in one sense that is not even compatible or commensurable with this other one, right? So you might, for example, think about something totally different where the forms that organize coordination are not themselves unifiable. Like, you could think something else. Like, so those are different ways of imagining how to break with a value form. So if you think that the central point of the value form is that it is a metric, then you can imagine a better one with, for example, like this sort of cyber project, right? If you think that the main thing about the value form is the form, then you might think of something God knows what, right? This is more the Heinrich, perhaps.
That's more of almost like orthodox, like just get rid of the property relations kind of thing. Like, it's more of a almost like a
this is more this is more classic. Yeah, but I think that this problem here is usually impossible, because get rid of the property relations is not a statement of a theory of property. So you say, great, thank you. I've read Capital and now I know that I need to not do what's inside the book. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So, like, the only way to actually formulate this, I think, is to have a broader theory here, right? Where this is expressible in this theory. Because this is expressible in this theory. Let's say this is the merit of this, right? It talks about this in the same way that it talks about this. Like, value is a certain form of metric. It has a certain level of complexity. We can think of a better one. Like you don't leave the end of the thinking process with the idea of mere negation of what you just thought, right? But in this case here, that's kind of where you get. Like if you start from a theory that is only able to express this, when you realize that the problem is like the very form of the thing, the next step falls outside of the thinking you were having, right? Okay, negate property relations. Fine, thank you very much. Like, okay, what does that mean, right? So I mean, this is why these guys call themselves socialists and they discuss Marx, but they're very willing to deform Marx, but to make him commensurable with experiments, right? But I think the condition is that the focus becomes, let's say, the metric. Now, I think our privilege at the moment is that we have here a value theory. This is usually one path, and this is usually another path, right? This leads to interesting things, but we kind of have an idea of what they are. And this leads to things we cannot think yet, right? But with Badiou, you can actually formalize this thing here. Like you can talk about the transcendental and about metrics, and to think about what can happen here that has an effect here. Because you have a formal system where these two things are thinkable, right? You can express both of them. Like this is a bigger theory, right? But it's almost like this is, for now, this is too big. Like this is actually like here. And there is a gap to this theory here, which don't know what it is. Like this is philosophical and it says everything, but in a bird's eye view, right?
Yeah, I mean, this split is exactly, I think, the split that we were talking about earlier with our text. That
yeah, I think so too.
Right?
Because I'm trying to focus more on this, right? Like, isn't organizational forms kind of able to substitute this and so on, right?
Exactly, like
I don't think it's
enhancing it.
Yeah. So I think that I mean, this kind of gets a bit clearer, you know? And I think that this goes back to the whole discussion that we had there about the transformation problem and other aspects of Marxism that I think we can treat not only as interesting problems, but almost like symptomatic points, because you can start asking yourself, okay, but why is it that this problem hasn't been solved for so long? Isn't it precisely a problem of not having the means to express it in a larger frame, right? Because, for example, the transformation problem, it requires you to think about not only the distinction, I mean, it pretty much is a problem of the relation between metric and form, right? Marx gives a formal presentation through volume 1, and then he says, yeah, but nobody actually measures the space that's structured like this with these terms. Like even the idea of commodity is then totally recast once you get the way that this space is covered, right? So it's like that's why we also added here this text, which unfortunately it's not translated yet. It's actually a Brazilian guy who wrote it. But it's actually, like I said, I think it's about to be translated, right?
I think he's working on it now.
So
maybe by the end of the year, it will be ready.
Because this guy is trying to, it's called Grespin. He pretty much tries to make this, like, clearly make this move, you know, from Capital Volume 1 to show like, and Capital Volume 2, and then show how something kind of recovers the whole space with Capital Volume 3. Right? So everything that you saw in these two first volumes is kind of rewritten in terms of prices of production, the equalization process, and so on. So if, let's say, in the first volume, we get the relation between, right, labor and capital, right? In the second volume, this is kind of seen from the perspective of circulation, but then in volume 3, you see it from the perspective of the relation between capitalists among themselves, right? So how does one signal to another how to equalize profit rates and things like this?
Yeah, it's almost like in Capital Volume 3, you've already adopted the metric. Now it's looking back on everything with that metric. How does everything make sense?
So I think, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Are we thinking that the metric is just like a measure of the transcendental? I think that's how we sort of talked about it. Or I guess like how does it come about, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a good question.
At least in the formalism of Badiou, I guess, because that's like how we've been thinking about it.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my very intuitive idea is that, I mean, if you move from, let's say, I mean, the very basic insight that I think we discussed that I think is good is that this here is partially ordered, and the metric would be totally ordered, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, that makes sense kind of with how we move from value to price, because the numerical expression, this is not numerically expressible. Like, it can be, right? But this is not how it is. Like, it's about quantities and commodities, really, and the proportion between the rates between them, right? That's why that, actually, I think we should add here also that Ulrich Krause guy, who showed like, man, like we can talk about exchange relations in terms of a relation R between commodities and the fact that they form a consistent matrix. Like, so the numericity of this is actually infinite, like it's actually totally variable, because the fact is that things vary together, right? But not that they have a particular quantitative value. So it's about a certain consistency of how these things can be ordered. Whereas with price is about, let's say, the number next to the commodity. So the commodity is fixed, and now this number that varies, right? And this is the thing that actually gives you so commodities are not totally ordered, right? It makes no sense to talk about commodities as being totally ordered, but the numbers are. So perhaps it's kind of, you can think of this as a move at that stake, something like this. I think. I'm not sure if this.
Yeah, I think it would be good to think about, I guess, like the logical structure of the space of value, right?
Mm-hmm.
To determine like a good model for it. Because for example, I mean, like what I'm thinking off the top of my head and what I've been thinking about before is that like maybe we can think about it as, right, the difference between value and price is the same thing as the difference between a measure space and the measure itself.
Mm-hmm.
The measure space is the organization of those things which have some value, and how they're organized in terms of their like sub objects and things, right? We can say this part of one thing has a certain value that is less than the thing that it is a part of. But there's no connection between things that are completely disjoint necessarily. But then the measure is what like compresses it all together.
Yeah.
I think it's important. We have to think about the logic of the space of value, because a measure is always what's called a sigma algebra, which is more restrictive than for example the Heyting algebra. Yeah. So I just think it just on like an abstract level, it's something that I don't really know.
Yeah, I think
which one is
totally
better for this
open.
purpose, but yeah, it's a good problem to think about.
But I think that this is also useful because, again, it seems like there is, I mean, it's not only, this is why I think it's interesting, because it's not simply saying, oh, let's give a categorical treatment to Marx, because the very selection of some approach, which is what Badiou kind of already did, of local topoi and things like this, it's kind of a way to guarantee that some of the bedrock of what you're going to use if it is compatible with that bedrock, then it is compatible with unifying a theory of the world with a theory of the experiment, right?
Mhm.
So you could perhaps do something which is broader and richer, but at the same time, you might be losing that connection. So it's kind of like we can take that from him, keep it as a kind of criteria in the background, and know that we can enrich this description with things that singularize what we're talking about to make it fit value relations, political organization, and so on, and still being sure that this is compatible in that other sense, right? So yeah, and I mean, all of this to say that it seems to me that both the transformation problem, which is funny because it is almost the version inside of political economy of the duality we were talking about between political economy and political organization, right? Because it's the move from the formal description of political economy to the political economy as a coordination problem between capitalists, right? That's, let's say, the coordination problem within Marx might be the transformation problem, right? And in a certain sense, when we talk about introducing into Marx the problem of political experimentation, coordination, organization, it's like generalizing the transformation problem to something even worse, right? So sure, we already don't know how to explain how we move from value to the theory of representation of capitalist relations, which is already something all Marxists are kind of struggling with. How about we make it even worse by saying that we want this solution to also allow for different forms of representation of social space? So, but sometimes generalizing
ambitious,
actually makes it easier to solve, right? So it might not be a bad strategy.
That's very true in mathematics, actually.
The special case is usually the bitch.
Yeah, I mean, often like problems in analysis, when you bring them over to topology, they become like super trivial things that seemed very difficult before, and they also generalize much better.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think that there might be something similar here, you know, and this is also part of the reason why I sorry, did you say something?
No.
That's right. This is also why I added this guy, because I mean, there is let me see if I can find it here. Not only did he beat Lenin at chess, see how angry Lenin is.
That's good.
Not only did he do that, and I mean, to beat the political strategist of the century, it's not. But let me see if I can find the text. I really recommend this. It's really short text, but this guy pretty much suggests, and I mean, if you read Bogdanov's actual work, let me see if this is the actual text. Of course, it's not going to be, right? No. Bogdanov was a guy who in 1910 or God knows when, he suggested that there was a mistake, not a mistake in Marx, but a sort of unnecessary restriction, because the concept of production in Marx is a derivation from the concept of organization. So the primitive concept of political economy should be organization and not production, because production is a form of a reorganization of two systems, a natural and a social one. And he came up with this idea of techtology, which is just a general theory. He tried to bridge many things at the same time. His first concern was to say we live in a society of specialized knowledge. The only thing that different knowledges have in common is that they organize representations in different ways. So a theory of organization is the only thing that is gonna kind of solve the problem of specialization in knowledge. Plus, we have multiple sectors of society organized in multiple different ways. The only way to kind of overcome the division of labor is also with a theory not of partial labors, but of what they have in common, which is that they are forms of reorganizing something. So he thought a theory of organization is the name of the thing that is larger than the theory of political economy. And this is a short text. His actual book is amazing, but this guy argues that what Bogdanov was trying to do remains more general than systems theory and cybernetics. And he tries to, and it's very amazing that if you look at the sort of things that he says are in Bogdanov's theory. So Bogdanov basically talks about three types of complexes, three types of organizations. Organized complexes are the one where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Disorganized complexes is ones where the whole is less than the sum of the parts, and neutral complexes is the organizations where the whole is equal to the sum of the parts. For him, mathematics mathematics is a general theory of neutral complexes. And you can see that this is what it was back in his day, right? I mean, you don't have that restriction today that you can only formalize things that the whole is equal to the parts, right? But he uses this general approach and tries to develop what it means for neutral organizations to interact with disorganized ones and organized ones to interact with disorganized. And he has this concept that I think you'll find very relatable. For example, he says, I think this guy gives a very short definition. So first thing is that there is no such thing as a disorganized, like a totally disorganized system. So for him, pure disorganization is the same as non-being. And so everything is minimally organized. Then he says, so you can think about complexes joined together. So the basic concept for him is the idea of ingression, which is the intersection between two systems. The inverse of it, also a sort of disjunction, disingression. Then you get the concept of organizational crisis, which is when a breach in technological boundary between two complexes is a start of a conjunctive process, a creation of a new one. It's a conjunctive crisis because two things, for example, might become one, right? And you have disjunctive crises where things that were one might become two. And he develops a bunch of different concepts that later on, like part of them became part of complexity theory and systems theory. But it was a much broader theory, which has the main objective of, I think he doesn't go into what I wanted in this text. But it is basically a theory of basic laws of organization, like conjunction, disjunction, how one thing might totally include the other, how one thing might disrupt the other, how the organization of this one thing, when put in contact with the organization of this other thing, might be totally outside of it. Nothing can be expressed in one or another, or you need a third thing without which, like, these are compatible, these are incompatible, and through this thing here, it becomes compatible with this one. And with the purpose of creating a theory. It's called techtology because it's kind of like tectonic, right? You have organized systems interacting with others, right? So you are interested in this boundary here. But the techtology was supposed to be a bit bigger than political economy and a theory and political organization, right? And in fact, it was also bigger than epistemology. Epistemology was here. and it was supposed to be the theory of what these things have in common. He was he's the reason why Lenin wrote materialism and imperial criticism, like to criticize him and saying that he was crazy and this made no sense and so on. And it's funny because he's the first Russian author to kind of quote Einstein's first papers, and it was very, very in line, very up to date with the physics of his time and things like this. And it was kind of left. Nobody developed this stuff. And currently there is a sort of recognition that the stuff that he was trying to do is actually broader than the stuff that appeared in the West with cybernetics and general systems theory. And it had a sort of underlying kind of motivation coming from Marx and from how do we recast political economy in broader terms in such a way that the theory of the thing that comes after the division of labor in society is already formulatable in our terms. So he is kind of a precursor for all of this, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah, I like that.
So that's why I said I thought of adding the guy here, because if anyone asks if we're crazy, we can say, well, there's a long line of crazy people before, you know, it's like not my fault. It's that guy's fault. So I think that if you try to think of, let's say, a guy who had a communist commitment, idea that a theory of political practice needs to be integrated with the theory of political economy, a concern with, let's say, the form of knowledge that makes different knowledges composable, you know? Like he was the Badiou of the Marxist, Soviet Marxist, kind of, it's very similar. So if we go back to that idea that Badiou is a bit too abstract for us, right? Perhaps like in bridging this gap here, where today we have that disjunction between political economy and critique of political economy here, political organization. And here we have subject theory, a theory of experiments, and a theory of worlds that are very well connected, but too abstract. I think Bogdanov is somewhere in the middle here, right? It's a bit inconsistent and it's too vague and perhaps tries to do too much with too little, but it's definitely something that has to do with this middle ground. You know?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, just define why the hell I added the guy to this thing.
Do you know where the paper is, the short one? I found the PDF for the whole book.
This short one I just showed you, I'll just send it to you guys.
Okay, perfect.
It's called, I'll just find it here. I think there's some nice stuff coming out now on his work, but it's very, very unknown. I mean, in Marxism, it's totally kind of forgotten. Where is that text?
Yeah, I think exactly if we want to read this debate again between transformation problem as like choosing a new metric versus choosing a totally different form of organization or whatever, I think it kind of fits in this, like those two things are kind of the same from the standpoint of Bogdanov, right?
Yeah, I think I mean, I think that's the sort of thing he would like to ask these things in his grammar. Like he might provide a grammar to think about these things that is useful. For example, one way I think we could Raquel just her internet just dropped. One way that we could think about this is in his terms, is to say, okay, you know, labor is actually, I mean, and I think that this actually solves another problem that we didn't mention, but which, let's say, we're mostly talking, let's say, top down, from value to society structure. But there's also the inverse problem, which is many of these guys, and especially guys like, for example, Cockshott, they talk about labor as a sort of primitive because unimaginable that you could reproduce society without work. Like things need to be transformed. And that's not a problem, but you don't need to argue that labor is not a primitive by finding something else, by substituting it for something else. You can also decompose the concept of labor, right? And I mean, even in a physical sense, work is a relational concept. Like you're not simply talking about no system does work without something happening, right? I mean, it needs to go contra gradient to entropy in some sense, right? So you might, for example, use the energy of one system to affect changes on the other. You might use the very entropic principle of one system to affect negentropic effects on the other, things like this. But the concept itself is relational. It is, and this I think is part of Bogdanov's point, that work is a particular relation between organizations, right? Let's say an environment in a small organization, or one organized system and another. It can be a person, it can be a set of people, or whatever. So
yeah, it can be nature, in fact, right?
It can be nature and so on. So
ecosystems.
The idea is that you can actually decompose a concept that usually thought of as primitive in order to also open up that black box, right? So work is actually a form of reorganizing stuff. So organization is, let's say, also a nice perspective on the whole thing. And he called this the organizational point of view. Like, don't look at stuff as if you got to the sort of minimal point when you get to labor, because there are specific conditions under which something counts as labor, even in not in the capitalist sense, but in the physical sense. So you can actually go a bit lower in your description, right? And the crazy thing is that when you go lower, you also make it compatible with the higher, right? So the same thing that takes the sort of anthropological privilege of human beings are creatures that live through work. Yeah, okay, the level of transformation of resources we need to keep alive might be higher than the other animals, right? But if you think in terms of reorganizing the environment, suddenly you're not so distinct from everything else, right?
Yeah.
And the distinction
and also, yeah, it also shifts from not just what counts as labor, but also what labor actually does, right? Because I think we don't think about that very often. It reminds me of this one short paper from Keynes back in like the 30s or 40s, and he was like predicting based on productive growth that like in the year 2020 or whatever, maybe it was 2010, or sometime around where we are now, people will be working like a 20-hour work week. So that's an example that comes to mind, right?
Yeah, like
we're more productive
time
than ever, but yeah.
Yeah, like we would all have a lot more free time.
Exactly. Yeah. But because of how labor is structured and organized, that just hasn't happened. Even though it can, like we have, I mean, and like we produce enough where that's totally doable.
Yeah, I think that this is the sort of, changing in way of looking at stuff that is interesting. For example, because on the point, like I was making on Diane Alston, for example. Well, she is saying that if you expand your concept of work to include something that didn't fit before because it's not productive, it's not transforming a system against its entropic tendencies, for example. For example, if you care for somebody who's dying, they're gonna die. You're just gonna be there. Like it's not gonna turn around the tendency of anything, right? Or if you're, let's say, easing the refreshing of your capacity so that somebody can go back to work tomorrow. Yeah, I mean, you could say that the guy working is the one who transformed something and he got some transformed products back from his work, and that's the thing that is keeping him alive. But that mediation is a form of organization that doesn't fit a very strict notion of work. So you kind of start getting a common theory for all those things, right?
Psychoanalysis included, right?
Psychoanalysis is one. We can't really talk about it as work today because it doesn't change people. Like people change themselves. So I mean, it's hard for me to justify as a Marxist why I should get paid.
Yeah, that's the real motivation here.
That's the real motivation behind all of this. So I think that this idea of simultaneously kind of recasting political economy in terms that brings us closer to Badiou's theory of situation, but also keeping in mind that you want this organizational point of view to be kind of imprinting on this, because you want to make it commensurate with something else, right? It's not because we could make it in some way that it kind of closes off that possibility. You could, let's say, formalize a I think Badiou does this a bit. Like he almost equates states, like the existence of a transcendental with capitalism. Like it seems like so every political process is the fight against the existence of a transcendental as such, right? So the state of the situation is the state. So every process is against the state. I don't think that that's what he actually, if you look deep down, that's not really what the theory says, like what he's actually saying, but usually taken to mean this, right? So people don't really try to formalize the political version of these things in a smaller frame to keep open the possibility of something else, because he already there is the easy way out, which is simply saying, situations is capitalism. So whatever else happens is something else. Otherwise you can, but we can make this less abstract, I think.
Yeah,
So,
I think this is a great roadmap. I mean,
Yeah, I agree.
a lot of things here.
yeah, so my idea, I mean, I'm going to talk to Raquel later on as well about this, but my idea was to see if we could try to, I don't know, without, I mean, any sort of strict commitments to moving ahead with anything, like very loosely, just try perhaps to, single out, almost like, I'm not sure exactly what's the best way, we can think about this later, but single out perhaps like a trajectory to gloss on these things, perhaps each one can take one of those things and say, okay, in 15 days, I can kind of host the meeting on this. We don't need to move anywhere, but just start putting our feet on the water, like in the water and testing the water. And then the next 15 days, we do the same with another team. Or if we come up with a different team we haven't added, we add it, and then we do the same thing. I think this would be enough for these things to start to crystallize as all part of something similar, which I think is already a lot. And
yeah, we could do like a bit of a rotation.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I like that.
I mean, we don't need to kind of determine anything now, but I think it's a good kind of a good strategy for it.
Yeah, I agree. Let's just discuss scheduling, and we can.
Yeah. So I'll just
start on this.
Yeah, my idea. I'll just add Raquel because she's been working a lot on the transformation problem and these issues with Marx. She has a really cool thesis on Marx, Leibniz, and differential calculus. So
nice.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, and this is actually something we didn't add here, but like there is actually also the fact that Marx wrote a lot on mathematics, right? He actually thought that there was a problem with the presentation of infinitesimals with like Cauchy and these guys, and he said like, I can come up with a better presentation. And there's actually a sort of Marxist didactic approach to differential calculus that you can find in his mathematical manuscripts. I don't know where he found the time for this, but so perhaps there's also something to this. Like he did have a very specific view of what formalisms could do for him, and there are some good texts showing that some of the presentations in Capital are motivated by the sort of underlying wish that people would see the connection, between certain ways of describing variability and the very idea of where does this surplus come from? Part of his strategy to justify this, that you can get a sort of surplus through just kind of changes in how you differentiate productivity, that you can see that he thinks it's connected, or he wanted to at least metaphorically bring into the picture some mathematical material. So there might be also ways that he facilitates for us this path if we look into that as well. So I think I'll add that as a possible strand. I think Raquel might be interested also in presenting on it. But I'll add her to our chat on Facebook, and then we can just slowly chat there and see how we move along.
Sounds good.
Great.
Great, and I've recorded this, so it's kept for posterity, for the, if anything happens, other people can continue this. This
Continue the work.
Yeah,
If we all get taken by Corona.
exactly. Great, guys. I need to cook now. I'll use Bob Koch's method.
Yeah. The algebra of cooking.
Oh, the algebra of cooking, exactly. See you guys.
Good
Take care,
talking to you
guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.